Some losses cut so deep that 20 years feels like yesterday. For Titan Caldwell, the memory of watching his wife and daughter slip away from fever still echoed in every cold mountain wind. The folks in Cedar Ridge always said the same thing about the old cave on Devil's Peak. No one lives in that cave. Strange lights flickered there on dark nights. Voices drifted out when no one should be inside. Most trappers stayed far away from it. Titan had heard these stories for years and figured they were just mountain talk. He had bigger problems than ghost tales. But when a fierce blizzard forced him to take shelter near that cave, everything changed. Deep inside, he found signs that someone had been living there. Fresh fires, drawings on the stone walls, and then he heard it, a voice calling out his dead daughter's name. What secrets does this mountain hold? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind carved through Devil's Peak like a blade, sharp enough to steal a man's breath and humble enough to remind him of his place in the world. Titan Caldwell pulled his worn beaver coat tighter as he made his way down the narrow mountain trail, his pack heavy with the week's catch. At 57, his broad shoulders still carried the burden of wilderness life, with the same steady determination that had seen him through 2 decades of solitude. The leather pouch at his belt held a faded daguerreotype wrapped in oiled cloth, the only photograph he owned. Martha and Sarah smiled back at him from that fragile piece of silver and glass, frozen in a moment when life held promise instead of shadows. He'd taken to pulling it out during the long, silent evenings by his campfire, studying their faces as if he might discover something new in those familiar features. Cedar Ridge sat in the valley below like a handful of wooden blocks scattered by a child's hand. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, each one representing families gathered around warm hearths, sharing stories and planning for tomorrow. Titan had once known that comfort had once been the man who carved wooden toys by firelight, while his wife hummed lullabies and his daughter practiced her letters on a slate board. The memory of Sarah's laugh still caught him off guard sometimes. It would echo in his mind when he least expected it, while skinning a beaver by the creek or mending his traps in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd possessed that particular kind of joy that only children carry, the sort that finds wonder in snowflakes and makes games from shadows on the wall. Martha had been the steady heart of their small family. Where Sarah sparkled with energy, Martha glowed with quiet wisdom. She could read the weather in cloud formations, knew which herbs would ease a fever, and had a way of making their modest cabin feel like the finest mansion simply by being present. Her hands were always busy kneading bread, mending clothes, braiding Sarah's hair into perfect plaits each morning. The fever had taken them both in the space of a week. First Sarah, burning with a heat that no amount of cool water could ease, then Martha, worn down by grief and the same sickness that had claimed their daughter. Titan had been away checking his trap lines when it started, and by the time he returned, there was nothing left but 2 wooden crosses and a silence that had followed him ever since. He'd buried his grief the same way he buried everything else, deep and without ceremony. The other trappers in Cedar Ridge respected his solitude, understanding that some wounds needed distance to heal. They nodded when he came to town for supplies, shared whiskey when the winters grew too long, and never asked questions about the ghosts that haunted his eyes. The general store served as the town's unofficial gathering place, where news traveled faster than horses and rumors grew with each telling. Old Henrik, the store's owner, had known Titan since before the tragedy. He would set aside the best coffee beans, the sharpest knives, and occasionally a letter from the outside world that never came. Weather's turning ugly, Henrik would say each autumn, as if Titan couldn't feel it in his bones. Cave stories are starting up again too. Prospector came through last week, swearing he saw lights up on Devil's Peak. Titan always listened politely to these tales, the way a man listens to a child's fears about monsters under the bed. The mountain folk loved their legends, their explanations for every unexplained sound and shifting shadow. They needed something to blame for the loneliness that settled over the high country when winter locked them away from the world below. Devil's Peak rose like a monument to isolation, its northern face scarred by a cave opening that local folklore claimed was cursed. The opening stretched wide enough for a man to walk through upright, but the darkness beyond swallowed torchlight within a few dozen steps. Native tribes had avoided the area for generations, leaving behind only warnings carved into trees and stories passed down through whispered conversations. Titan had trapped these mountains for 20 years without giving the cave much thought. He'd built his reputation on practical knowledge, reading animal tracks, predicting weather patterns, finding shelter when storms rolled in with little warning. Superstition was a luxury he couldn't afford when survival depended on clear thinking and steady hands. His cabin sat 3 miles east of Cedar Ridge, positioned to catch the morning sun and shelter from the worst winter winds. He'd built it himself the summer after Martha and Sarah died, needing something to occupy his hands while his heart learned to beat with a different rhythm. The structure was solid and functional, like everything else in his life had become stripped of ornament and sentiment. Each morning began the same way, coffee brewed over the fire while he planned the day's route. His traps stretched across a territory he knew better than most men knew their own backyards. Every stream, every game trail, every shelter beneath overhanging rocks had earned its place in his mental map through years of careful observation. The work suited him because it demanded attention without requiring conversation. Animals moved according to patterns he could understand and predict. They didn't ask questions about the past or expect explanations for choices that couldn't be undone. A well-set trap either succeeded or failed based on skill and patience, not on the weight of memory or the ache of old wounds. Some evenings, when the wind died down and the mountains grew quiet, Titan would find himself listening for sounds that belonged to another life. Sarah's footsteps on wooden floors, Martha's voice calling him in for supper, the rustle of pages turning as she read stories aloud by lamplight. These moments came and went like weather, leaving him both grateful for their warmth and relieved when they passed. The photograph in his pocket had grown soft around the edges from handling, but their faces remained clear. Sarah's eyes held the same blue as mountain lakes in summer. Martha's smile carried the contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world. Looking at them reminded him not just of what he'd lost, but of what he'd once been capable of having. Trading visits to Cedar Ridge provided his only regular human contact. The townspeople had learned to respect his boundaries, while still including him in the loose community that frontier life required. When someone needed a guide through difficult terrain, they knew to ask Titan. When he needed supplies or news from the outside world, he knew Henrik would have what he required without unnecessary conversation. The mountain seasons had shaped him like water shapes. Stone gradually, persistently, until his edges matched the harsh beauty around him. Winter meant long periods of solitude, broken only by the sound of wind and the crack of freezing wood. Spring brought the rush of snowmelt and the return of game to familiar hunting grounds. Summer offered brief respites when the weather allowed for longer expeditions and encounters with other travelers. Autumn carried the urgency of preparation, the knowledge that another winter was approaching with its familiar demands. Through it all, the cave on Devil's Peak had remained a distant curiosity, notable mainly for the stories it inspired and the wide berth that sensible people gave it. Titan had passed near it countless times without feeling any particular pull toward its shadowed entrance. It was simply another feature of the landscape, like the eagle's nests on the highest crags or the hot springs that steamed in hidden valleys. But stories have a way of accumulating weight over time, and the tales about Devil's Peak had grown more frequent in recent months. Travelers spoke of strange lights dancing in the darkness. Local hunters reported sounds that didn't match any animal they knew. Even Henrik, who prided himself on practical thinking, had begun to look thoughtful when the cave came up in conversation. "Been hearing things myself," he'd admitted the previous week, lowering his voice despite being alone with Titan in the store. Night sounds that don't sit right, like someone calling from way up high, but there's nobody up there to do the calling. Titan had nodded and paid for his supplies without comment, but the conversation had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Not because he believed in spirits or curses, but because Henrik wasn't given to flights of imagination. If practical men were starting to pay attention to the stories, perhaps there was something worth investigating. The blizzard that would change everything was still building strength in the northern sky, gathering the cold fury that would drive him toward answers he'd never thought to seek. The storm hit Devil's Peak with the fury of something personal. Titan had been checking his northern trapline when the wind shifted, bringing with it the metallic smell of snow and the bone-deep cold that promised a blizzard. He'd weathered hundreds of such storms, but this one carried a violence that made even his experienced hands work faster as he secured his gear. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Snow began as scattered flakes, then thickened into a wall of white that erased the world beyond arm's reach. Titan knew these mountains well enough to navigate by instinct, but wisdom dictated finding shelter until the worst passed. His cabin lay 3 hours away in good weather, a journey that could prove fatal in conditions like these. Devil's Peak loomed through the storm like a dark promise. The cave opening he'd avoided for 20 years suddenly represented the difference between life and death. Pride was a luxury no man could afford when facing the mountain's wrath, and Titan had survived too long to let foolish superstition freeze him solid. He reached the cave entrance as the wind reached a howling crescendo. The opening yawned before him, darker than the storm-clouded sky, but offering blessed relief from the driving snow. Titan hesitated only a moment before stepping across the threshold, leaving the familiar world behind. Inside, the temperature rose noticeably. The cave extended deeper than torchlight could penetrate, but the entrance chamber provided enough space for a man to wait out even the worst weather. Titan shrugged off his pack and began the practiced routine of making camp, gathering dry wood from debris near the opening, building a small fire, arranging his bedroll away from any drafts. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, revealing formations that time and water had carved into strange shapes. Titan tried to focus on practical matters, checking his supplies, cleaning his rifle, planning tomorrow's route once the storm passed. But something about the cave unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. The fire crackled and popped, each sound echoing back from the depths with subtle distortions. What should have been comfortable solitude felt somehow crowded, as if the shadows harbored invisible watchers. Titan told himself it was simply the unfamiliar acoustics, the way enclosed spaces could play tricks on a man's perceptions. Then he saw it. Near the fire's wavering light, placed deliberately on a flat stone, as if waiting for his discovery, sat a small wooden horse. The carving was simple but skillfully made, the sort of toy a father might craft for his daughter during long winter evenings. Every detail was achingly familiar: the flowing mane, the prancing pose, the small notch in the left ear where his knife had slipped years ago. Titan's hands shook as he picked up the impossible object. He'd carved this horse for Sarah's 5th birthday, spending weeks perfecting each curve and detail. She'd carried it everywhere, talking to it like a trusted friend, creating elaborate adventures for its imaginary journeys. When fever claimed her, Martha had insisted they bury the horse with their daughter, saying it would keep her company in whatever came after. The wood felt warm beneath his fingers, as if recently touched by living hands. The surface showed signs of handling smooth spots where small fingers had traced familiar paths, tiny scratches that spoke of countless hours of play. This wasn't some similar toy created by coincidence. This was Sarah's horse. Impossible as that seemed, Titan's mind raced through rational explanations. Grave robbers, though what thief would steal a child's wooden toy? A mistake at the burial, though he remembered placing the horse in Sarah's hands himself? Some elaborate, cruel joke, though who in Cedar Ridge would know such intimate details of his loss? Each explanation crumbled under examination. The horse was real, solid, undeniably present in his trembling hands. But its existence challenged everything he believed about death, about the finality of loss, about the walls that separated the living from those who'd gone before. A sound echoed from deeper in the cave, soft, barely audible over the storm outside, but unmistakably human. A child's voice, high and clear, calling out a single word that froze Titan's blood. "Papa?" The word hung in the air like morning mist, present but insubstantial. Titan strained to listen, wondering if the wind had somehow created the illusion of speech. But caves didn't generate phantom voices, and storms didn't whisper in the tones of daughters 20 years dead. "Sarah?" The name escaped his lips before rational thought could prevent it. His voice cracked with 20 years of unspoken grief. 20 years of conversations that would never happen, 20 years of love with no object to receive it. Silence answered him, broken only by the wind's howl and his own ragged breathing. But the wooden horse remained warm in his hands, proof that something impossible was happening in the depths of Devil's Peak. Titan forced himself to examine the cave more carefully. The dancing firelight revealed details he'd missed in his initial survey. The walls showed signs of recent habitation, smooth areas where someone had sat repeatedly, blackened stones where fires had burned, scratches in the rock that might have been deliberate markings. Near the cave's far wall, a natural shelf held what looked like carefully arranged stones. As Titan moved closer with a burning branch for light, the arrangement resolved into something that made his heart race. 3 smooth river rocks, positioned in a perfect triangle, with dried wildflowers placed at their center. The pattern was achingly familiar. Sarah had built identical arrangements in their garden, calling them her fairy altars, and insisting they brought good luck to anyone who needed it. She'd spent hours collecting just the right stones, searching for flowers that met her exacting standards, positioning everything with the serious concentration that children brought to important work. Titan knelt beside the arrangement, noting how fresh the flowers appeared despite being in an underground cave. The petals showed no signs of wilting, the stems remained supple and green. It was as if someone had placed them there within hours of his arrival. A whisper of movement caught his attention, not sound exactly, but the sense of displaced air that spoke of presence. The shadows at the cave's edge seemed to shift and flow, forming shapes that suggested human forms before dissolving back into ordinary darkness. "Martha?" This time he didn't fight the impulse to speak. If madness was claiming him, he'd rather embrace it than continue this dance of denial and fear. "Martha, is that you?" The response came not as voice, but as sensation, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. A presence that felt like arms around his shoulders, a comfort that tasted of home-baked bread and lullabies sung in the darkness. For a moment that lasted forever, Titan felt less alone than he had in 20 years. But the moment passed, leaving him kneeling in a cave with a child's toy and questions that defied every rational explanation. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, trapping him with mysteries that challenged his understanding of life, death, and the thin places where they might overlap. Titan settled back against the cave wall, the wooden horse clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Tomorrow, he would return to Cedar Ridge with questions that had no answers. Tonight, he would wait in the darkness and listen for voices that couldn't exist, hoping for another glimpse of the family he'd thought lost forever. The fire burned lower as exhaustion finally claimed him. In his dreams, Sarah laughed while Martha hummed old songs, and somewhere in the depths of Devil's Peak, the mountain itself seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that matched his own. The storm passed sometime before dawn, leaving Devil's Peak wrapped in crystalline silence. Titan woke to find himself clutching the wooden horse so tightly that its edges had left impressions in his palm. In the grey light filtering through the cave entrance, the previous night's events felt like fever dreams, born of exhaustion and isolation. But the horse remained solid and real in his hands. The stone altar still held its impossible arrangement of fresh flowers. The marks on the cave walls spoke of habitation that defied explanation. Whatever had happened in the darkness, it couldn't be dismissed as the product of an overtired mind. Titan packed his gear with methodical care, but left the wooden horse visible on top of his supplies. If madness was claiming him, he preferred to face it openly, rather than pretend the impossible hadn't occurred. The journey back to Cedar Ridge passed in contemplative silence, each step carrying him further from the cave's mysteries and closer to a world governed by rational laws. Henrik looked up from his ledger as Titan entered the general store, noting immediately the wooden toy that protruded from the trapper's pack. His weathered face showed the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to ask questions too quickly. "Rough night up there," Henrik observed, pouring coffee from the pot that always simmered near his iron stove. "Storm came down like the devil's own fury." Titan accepted the mug gratefully, using the hot liquid to buy time while he decided how much to reveal. "Found shelter in the cave on Devil's Peak. First time I've been inside. And—" Henrik's tone carried the patience of someone who understood that important stories required their own timing. Titan pulled the wooden horse from his pack and set it on the counter between them. "Found this, waiting for me. Made it for my daughter 20 years ago. Buried it with her when the fever took them both." Henrik studied the toy without touching it, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching reverence. "That's fine workmanship. You always did have skilled hands for carving. You don't seem surprised to see it." The storekeeper moved to his window, gazing up toward the distant peak that jutted against the morning sky. "Been hearing stories about that cave my whole life. Most I dismissed as frontier nonsense, lonely men seeing things that weren't there. But lately—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lately the stories have been coming from folks I trust." "What kind of stories?" "Missing objects turning up where they shouldn't be. Voices calling names that only certain people should know. Lights moving in the depths when no living soul should be carrying them." Henrik turned back to face Titan. "There's someone in this town who knows more about such things than either of us. Ezra Whitmore. Been here since before the first cabins were built." Titan knew Ezra by reputation, an elderly man who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge decades earlier with more books than belongings and a knowledge of local history that bordered on encyclopedic. People sought him out when they needed information about land grants, mineral rights, or the location of long-forgotten landmarks. "Where might I find him?" "Cabin behind the church." "But Titan," Henrik's voice carried a warning, "Ezra's got theories about that cave that most folks aren't ready to hear. Once you start down that path, it's hard to find your way back to simple explanations." The walk to Ezra's cabin gave Titan time to consider what he was asking for. For 20 years, he'd built his life around accepting loss, moving forward despite grief, finding purpose in solitude. Now he was actively seeking information that might shatter that carefully constructed peace. Ezra's cabin looked like it had been assembled by someone who valued books more than building codes. Every surface held stacks of papers, journals, and volumes that spoke of a lifetime spent accumulating knowledge. The man himself appeared ancient but alert, with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his unexpected visitor. "You're Caldwell," Ezra said before Titan could introduce himself. "Heard about your family. Terrible thing, losing them to fever." Titan placed the wooden horse on the only clear space he could find on Ezra's cluttered table. "Found this in the cave on Devil's Peak last night. Made it for my daughter. Should be in her grave." Ezra examined the toy with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. His fingers traced the carved mane, tested the smoothness of wear patterns, noted the distinctive notch that marked it as uniquely crafted. "How much do you know about this land's history?" Ezra asked finally. "Enough to survive on it. Not much beyond that. The native tribes called Devil's Peak by a different name. Roughly translated, it means the place where spirits wait. They believed certain locations held power doorways between the world of the living and whatever comes after death." Titan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You're talking about Indian superstition." "Am I?" Ezra moved to a particular bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound journal that looked older than the town itself. This belonged to one of the first trappers to work these mountains. Listen to this entry from 1823. He opened to a page marked with faded ribbon and read in a voice that carried the weight of years. The cave draws men who've lost what they cannot bear to lose. Found Johnson there yesterday, talking to shadows and claiming his dead wife was calling to him. Poor fool had been missing for 3 days. When we brought him down, he carried a lock of hair that should have been buried with the woman 2 years past. Ezra closed the journal and met Titan's eyes directly. That's not the only account. I've documented 17 similar incidents over the past 50 years. Men finding objects that belonged to deceased family members, hearing voices of the dead, seeing figures that couldn't exist. And you believe these accounts? I believe the evidence. Objects appear that have no rational explanation for their presence. Multiple witnesses report similar phenomena. The cave itself shows signs of habitation when no living person admits to entering it. Titan thought of the stone altar, the fresh flowers, the warmth that had surrounded him in the darkness. What's your theory? Ezra moved to his window, looking up toward Devil's Peak with the expression of someone who'd spent years puzzling over an unsolvable mystery. There are places in this world where the boundaries grow thin, where love and loss create openings. The cave seems to be one such place. You're saying my wife and daughter are alive in there? Not alive, not in any way we understand life, but perhaps not entirely gone either, perhaps waiting for something or someone that would allow them to find peace. The possibility hit Titan like a physical blow. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of final partings, last words that would never be spoken, love that would never find expression. The thought that Martha and Sarah might somehow still exist, still be reachable, challenged everything he'd built his survival upon. If that's true, Titan said slowly, then I need to go back. Ezra nodded, as if he'd been expecting this response. Before you do, there's something else you should see. He led Titan to a trunk in the corner of the cabin, removing items wrapped in oiled cloth. Each object told a story of loss and impossible return. A child's shoe found in the cave 40 years after its owner's death, a wedding ring discovered by a widower who'd buried it with his wife, a carved pipe that appeared decades after its maker had passed on. Every man who's encountered the phenomena faces the same choice, Ezra explained. Accept that some mysteries can't be solved and return to ordinary life, or pursue answers that might change everything they believe about death and what comes after. Titan studied the collection of impossible objects, each one representing someone's confrontation with the unexplainable. The wooden horse in his hands suddenly felt heavier, weighted with implications that stretched far beyond his own grief. If I go back, what should I expect? The truth, Ezra said simply, but truth has a way of demanding more than we're prepared to give. 3 days passed before Titan could bring himself to return to Devil's Peak. He spent the time gathering proper equipment, extra lanterns, rope, camping supplies that would allow him to explore the cave's depths methodically. Ezra provided additional resources, a detailed map of the cave system based on previous explorations, sketches of the symbols found carved into various chamber walls, and a leather satchel containing items that might prove useful if the supernatural theories held truth. Remember, Ezra had warned, approach this as you would any dangerous territory, with respect, preparation, and healthy caution. Whatever exists in that cave has been waiting for decades. It can wait a little longer for you to do this properly. The November air carried winter's promise as Titan climbed toward the cave entrance. His pack held enough supplies for several days, along with writing materials to document whatever he discovered. If madness was claiming him, he preferred to chronicle its progression rather than disappear into mystery like so many others had before him. The cave mouth welcomed him like an old friend. Inside, the temperature remained surprisingly comfortable, as if some unseen force regulated the environment for human habitation. Titan established his base camp in the familiar entrance chamber, But this time, he came prepared to venture deeper into the mountain's heart. His first systematic exploration revealed that the cave extended much further than torchlight had suggested. Natural passages branched off in multiple directions, some leading to dead ends, others opening into chambers large enough to house entire families. The walls showed clear evidence of human presence, smooth areas worn by countless hands, soot marks from fires, and symbols carved with deliberate care. In a chamber roughly 50 feet from the entrance, Titan made his second impossible discovery. Folded neatly on a natural stone shelf, as if placed there moments before his arrival, lay a small blue dress. The fabric remained supple and clean despite being underground, showing no signs of moisture damage or decay that such an environment should produce. Titan recognized the dress immediately. Martha had sewn it for Sarah's 6th birthday, using fabric purchased during their last trip to the territorial capital. Sarah had worn it for special occasions, Sunday services, visits to town, the photography session that produced the daguerreotype he still carried. The dress even retained Sarah's scent, a mixture of wildflowers and childhood innocence that transported Titan back to evenings when he'd carried his tired daughter to bed, breathing in that particular fragrance that belonged only to her. The sensation was so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment he expected to hear her voice asking for one more story before sleep. Sarah? The name echoed through the chamber, returning to him with subtle harmonics that suggested vast spaces beyond his light's reach. "Are you here, sweetheart?" Silence answered, but it felt different from the empty quiet of true solitude. This silence held weight, presence, the sense of being observed by invisible watchers who chose when and how to reveal themselves. Titan carefully folded the dress and placed it in his pack alongside the cry. Wooden horse. Each impossible object demanded explanation, but explanation seemed less important than acceptance. Whatever force governed this place operated by rules he didn't understand, but it had twice returned pieces of his lost family to him. Deeper exploration revealed more chambers, each containing evidence of long-term habitation. Someone or something had been living in the cave system for an extended period. Makeshift furniture crafted from stones and wood, storage areas containing preserved food and basic supplies, sleeping areas arranged with the care of permanent residents rather than temporary visitors. Most unsettling were the personal touches that spoke of human comfort and routine. Wildflowers arranged in natural vases, smooth stones positioned for seating around cold fire rings, crude but recognizable drawings scratched into softer sections of wall, depicting scenes of family life that might have been memories or wishes. As evening approached, Titan established his camp in the largest chamber he'd discovered. The space felt like a natural gathering place, with good acoustics and multiple passages leading to other areas of the cave system. He built his fire in a ring of stones that showed clear signs of previous use, adding his light to countless others that had burned in this same location. The flames revealed more details about his surroundings. The chamber walls bore extensive markings, some clearly ancient, others appearing much more recent. Names were carved alongside dates spanning decades. Messages left by previous visitors told stories of loss, hope, and encounters with the unexplainable. Martha Caldwell appeared among the newer inscriptions, carved in letters that matched his wife's careful handwriting. Below it, in the uncertain script of a young child, someone had scratched, "Sarah wants Papa to come home." Titan traced the letters with trembling fingers. The carving showed no signs of weathering, as if it had been made recently, despite his wife having been dead for 20 years. The stone around the inscription felt warm to the touch, radiating a heat that had nothing to do with his campfire. As full darkness settled over the mountain, the cave began to reveal its nocturnal character. Sounds echoed from the deeper passages, not the random noises of settling rock or shifting air, but purposeful movements that suggested inhabitants going about their evening routines. Footsteps whispered through distant chambers, too light to be adult, but too deliberate to be imagination. Voices murmured conversations in tones too soft to understand, but clear enough to recognize as human speech. Somewhere in the depths, someone hummed a lullaby that Martha used to sing during Sarah's bedtime rituals. Titan found himself responding to these phantom sounds as if they were completely natural. "I'm here," he called into the darkness. "I found the dress and the horse. I know you're waiting for me." The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Titan could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the chamber walls. Then, soft as morning mist, came the response he'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Papa." The voice carried Sarah's distinctive cadence, the slight lisp she'd never quite outgrown, the questioning tone she used when seeking reassurance. "Papa, we've been waiting so long." This time Titan didn't question his sanity or seek rational explanations. He simply answered his daughter with the love that had never diminished, despite 20 years of separation. "I'm here, sweetheart. Papa's here now. Mama says you have to be brave. She says there are things you need to remember before we can come home." The words struck Titan like cold water. Remember what? What memories could his family need him to recover? But before he could ask for clarification, the presence faded, leaving him alone with questions that demanded answers he wasn't certain he possessed. The fire burned lower as Titan settled into his bedroll. The dress and wooden horse arranged nearby like talismans against whatever revelations tomorrow might bring. In the darkness beyond his light's reach, he sensed patient watchers keeping vigil through the night, waiting for him to find the courage to face whatever truths lay buried in the deepest chambers of both the cave and his own heart. Dawn filtered through the cave entrance like a gentle reminder that the ordinary world still existed beyond the mountain's mysteries. Titan woke to find his campfire reduced to glowing embers, but the chamber felt warmer than it should have given the November cold outside. More importantly, he wasn't alone. Arranged in the space between his bedroll and the fire, someone had built a new altar during the night. 3 smooth river stones formed a perfect triangle, just as Sarah used to arrange them in their garden. But this construction held additional elements that made Titan's breath catch in his throat. At the triangle's center sat a cluster of wildflowers, the same mountain lilies that had grown near their cabin. The ones Sarah had insisted brought good luck to anyone who found them. The blooms appeared fresh-picked despite the season, their petals still holding dewdrops that sparkled in the firelight like tiny stars. Surrounding the stones, someone had placed small objects that told the story of his family's life together. A pine cone from the tree where he'd built Sarah's swing, a smooth pebble from the creek where Martha used to wash clothes, a sprig of wild mint that Martha had used to flavor their evening tea. Each item was precisely positioned, arranged with the same careful attention to detail that Sarah had brought to her childhood rituals. The altar radiated a sense of purpose and communication, as if his family was trying to speak to him through symbols and memories rather than words. Titan knelt beside the arrangement, noting how the stones still held warmth from the hands that had placed them. "I see it, Sarah. I remember your fairy altars. You said they brought messages from heaven." The response came not as voice, but as sensation, a gentle pressure on his shoulder, the whisper of small arms encircling his neck, the familiar weight of his daughter seeking comfort and offering it in return. For a moment that lasted forever, Titan felt 6 years old again, all gap-toothed smiles and endless questions about how the world worked. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered to the empty air that felt somehow full of presence. A sound drew his attention toward the chamber's far wall, a soft scraping that spoke of deliberate movement rather than random settling. Following the noise led him to a narrow passage he'd overlooked in the previous day's exploration. The opening was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, but a current of warmer air suggested it led to larger spaces beyond. Titan gathered his lantern and rope, marking his path carefully as he squeezed through the passage. The tunnel curved and twisted for perhaps 30 feet before opening into a chamber that took his breath away. Natural formations had created what could only be described as an underground chapel, complete with cathedral-like acoustics and stone formations that resembled stained glass windows when light played across their surfaces. But the chamber's most remarkable feature was human-made. Someone had spent considerable time and effort transforming the space into a comfortable living area. Stone shelves held carefully preserved food, clothing, and personal items. A natural depression in the floor had been lined with soft moss and blankets to create a bed large enough for 2 people. Clay vessels collected water from a steady drip, ensuring fresh drinking supplies. The walls told stories through an extensive collection of drawings and carvings. Some appeared ancient, possibly the work of indigenous peoples who had used the cave for spiritual purposes. Others showed the clear handiwork of more recent visitors, frontier families seeking shelter, trappers marking their passage, lovers carving their initials into stone that would outlast their mortal lives. But one section of wall commanded Titan's complete attention. Someone had spent months, perhaps years, creating an elaborate mural that depicted the story of a family's life together. The scenes progressed chronologically across the stone surface, showing a man and woman building a cabin, working together to create a home, welcoming a daughter who brought joy to their wilderness existence. The artwork displayed remarkable skill and attention to detail. Titan recognized himself in the male figure, younger, happier, unmarked by the weight of loss that would come later. Martha appeared in dozens of scenes, her gentle strength captured in confident strokes that spoke of deep observation and profound love. Sarah dominated the later panels, growing from infant to child to the 6-year-old girl who lived forever in his memory. The final scenes showed their last weeks together. Martha tending Sarah's sickbed, Titan returning from his trap lines to find his world forever changed. The heartbreaking aftermath of loss that had defined his existence ever since. But the mural didn't end with tragedy. Additional panels showed his family's continued existence in some form, waiting and watching and hoping for reunion. Titan traced the painted figures with trembling fingers, noting details that only someone intimately familiar with their lives could have known. The way Martha always tucked a strand of hair behind her left ear when concentrating, Sarah's habit of standing on one foot when excited, his own unconscious gesture of touching the spot where his watch pocket held Martha's photograph. How? The word echoed through the chamber, carrying 20 years of grief and confusion. How can you know these things? Movement in his peripheral vision made him turn. Standing at the chamber's entrance, translucent as morning mist but unmistakably real, stood Martha. She appeared exactly as he remembered her, not as she'd looked during the fever's final stages, but as she'd been during their happiest days together. Her dress was the blue gingham he'd bought her for their anniversary, her hair arranged in the style she'd favored for special occasions. "Because we never left, my love." Her voice carried the warmth of summer afternoons and the comfort of shared sorrows. "We've been waiting for you to find us." Titan wanted to reach for her, to close the distance that death had imposed between them. But something in her expression warned him that the rules governing this place required patience and understanding rather than desperate action. "I don't understand. You died. I buried you both on the hill behind the cabin. Our bodies died, yes, but love doesn't end just because breathing stops. This place," she gestured to encompass the chamber around them, "this place holds what can't be let go, what refuses to accept endings." "Then you're trapped here?" Martha's smile carried the gentle correction she'd used when explaining difficult concepts to Sarah. "Not trapped. Waiting. There are things that must be understood, forgiveness that must be given, truth that must be faced before we can find peace." Before Titan could ask what truth she meant, Sarah appeared beside her mother, equally translucent but radiating the irrepressible energy that had defined her short life. "Papa, you found our secret house. We made it beautiful for when you came to visit." The sight of his daughter whole happy, unchanged by death, nearly drove Titan to his knees. She looked exactly as she had on the last morning he'd seen her alive, wearing the dress that now rested in his pack, her hair in the braids that Martha had woven with such loving care. "We have so much to show you," Sarah continued, bouncing slightly in the way she'd done when excited about sharing discoveries. "Mama taught me to draw on the walls, and I found a place where the water sings songs, and there are rooms deeper down where the mountain keeps its best secrets." Titan found his voice at last. "How long have you been here?" "Since always," Sarah answered with the matter-of-fact logic of childhood. "Since the sad day when we had to leave the cabin. Mama said we couldn't go to the bright place until you came to say goodbye properly." The implications of her words settled over Titan like stone. For 20 years, his family had been waiting in this mountain sanctuary, unable to find peace because some essential task remained unfinished. Whatever truth Martha had referenced, whatever forgiveness needed to be given or received, it was the key to freeing them from their twilight existence. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of discovery and revelation. Martha and Sarah appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes solid enough to cast shadows, other times mere whispers of presence that Titan felt rather than saw. They guided him through chambers he would never have found alone, showing him wonders that the mountain had kept hidden for countless generations. Sarah delighted in being his tour guide, chattering about her discoveries with the enthusiasm she'd brought to everything in life. She led him to a chamber where underground streams created natural music, where the acoustics transformed dripping water into something resembling cathedral bells. Another room held crystals that captured and reflected light in patterns that painted rainbow murals on the walls. "This is where I come to think about home," Sarah explained, settling cross-legged beside a pool that mirrored the chamber's ceiling. "I remember the cabin and the garden and the swing you built by the big pine tree. Do you still have the swing, Papa?" The question pierced Titan's heart. He'd dismantled the swing the day after the funeral, unable to bear seeing it empty and still. "No, sweetheart, I took it down after you had to leave." "Oh." Sarah's disappointment was momentary but profound. "I hoped it was still there. I liked swinging so high I could see over the mountains." Martha appeared beside them, her presence bringing comfort to both daughter and husband. "She talks about the swing often, about flying high enough to touch the clouds." These conversations felt simultaneously natural and impossible. Titan found himself slipping into old patterns of family interaction, answering Sarah's endless questions, sharing quiet moments with Martha, feeling the contentment that had defined their life together. Yet underneath the familiar rhythms lay the constant awareness that this was not life as he understood it. On the 4th day, Martha led him to a chamber he'd not yet explored. Unlike the others, this space felt different, older, more purposeful, charged with significance that made the air itself seem heavier. The walls held carvings that predated any frontier settlement, symbols and figures that spoke of indigenous spiritual practices and ancient ceremonies. At the chamber's center sat a natural altar, formed by converging stone formations. Around it, arranged with obvious care, were objects that told the story of multiple families who had faced loss and sought answers in the mountain's depths. Each item represented someone's attempt to connect with the departed, to find meaning in grief, to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. But dominating the display was something that made Titan's blood run cold, a leather-bound journal that he recognized immediately. The book had belonged to Martha, a wedding gift from her mother that she'd used to record family milestones, household accounts, and private thoughts during their years together. Martha watched as he approached the journal with trembling hands. "You need to read it, my love. All of it. Only then will you understand why we've been waiting." The journal's pages fell open to entries, written in Martha's familiar handwriting, but dated long after her death. The first entry was dated just 3 days after the funeral. November 15th, 1847. "We are still here, though not as we were." The fever took our bodies, but could not touch what bound us together. Sarah doesn't understand why Papa cannot see us, why he walks through the cabin crying our names. We try to comfort him, but our touches pass through him like morning mist. The mountain calls to us, promising shelter until he can join us properly. Titan's hands shook as he turned pages filled with impossible entries. Martha had documented their journey to the cave, their discovery of its unique properties, their growing understanding that love could transcend death under the right circumstances. Each entry revealed more about their existence in this twilight realm between life and whatever came after. December 3rd, 1847. Sarah has learned to gather the flowers that grow in the deep chambers, the ones that bloom without sunlight. She builds her fairy altars and insists they send messages to Papa, telling him, "We are safe and waiting." I begin to believe she may be right. There is power here, old and patient and kind, to those who grieve too deeply to let go. The entries continued through winter and into spring, documenting their adaptation to their new existence. They described learning to manipulate the physical world through concentrated will, how to appear to the living under certain conditions, the way the cave protected and nurtured spirits who couldn't find peace. But as Titan read deeper, a different truth began to emerge. The entries revealed details about their final days that differed from his memories, small discrepancies at first, then larger contradictions that challenged everything he thought he knew about how his family had died. January 20th, 1848. Titan still blames himself for leaving us during the fever, but he has forgotten the truth. We did not die in the cabin from sickness. We died here, in the cave. During the expedition, he planned to show us the mountain's hidden wonders. The fever story is his mind's way of protecting him from guilt too heavy to bear. But until he remembers what really happened, until he forgives himself for the choice he made, we cannot find our way to the light. The words hit Titan like physical blows. His memories of their final days, the fever, the gradual decline, the peaceful deaths in their own bed, began to waver and crack like ice under spring sun. Fragments of suppressed recollections surfaced, planning a family adventure to explore the cave system, Martha's excitement about showing Sarah the mountain's hidden chambers, his own eagerness to share his knowledge of the wilderness with those he loved most. Sarah appeared beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder with surprising warmth. "Papa, do you remember now? Do you remember our adventure?" The memories came rushing back with devastating clarity. The expedition to the cave system, meant to be a wonderful family outing. The sudden storm that trapped them underground, the rockfall that blocked their exit route, his desperate attempts to find another way out, while Martha and Sarah grew weaker from cold and hunger. The choice he'd been forced to make, leaving them in the relatively warm safety of the deep chambers, while he climbed through dangerous passages seeking help. His promise to return quickly with rescue, the second rockfall that separated them permanently, leaving him on the outside while they remained trapped within. By the time he'd gathered help and found another route into the cave system, 3 days had passed. He'd found their bodies in each other's arms, Martha having used her last strength to comfort Sarah through their final hours. The guilt had been unbearable, so overwhelming that his mind had constructed the fever story to explain their deaths without, forcing him to confront his role in their fate. "You tried to save us," Martha's voice carried infinite forgiveness. "You did everything a man could do, but the mountain had other plans. I left you." The words tore from Titan's throat, like confession and accusation combined. "I promised to come back quickly, and I failed. You died because I couldn't find my way to you in time." "We died because it was our time," Martha corrected gently. "But we couldn't leave because you carried our burden as well as your own. Your guilt has kept us tethered here, unable to let go and find peace." Sarah moved closer, her presence radiating the uncomplicated love that had defined their relationship. "We're not angry, Papa. We never were. But you have to stop being angry at yourself before we can go home to the bright place." The journal held more entries, documenting their vigil through 20 years of waiting. They had watched him retreat from life, seen him build walls around his heart, felt his daily struggle with guilt and loss. Their love had become a chain binding them to this mountain sanctuary, where they waited for him to find the strength to forgive himself and set them free. The revelation of suppressed memories shattered the careful structure Titan had built around his grief. But the journal held one final secret that would transform everything he thought he understood about his family's fate. As he turned to the book's final pages, Martha's entries gave way to different handwriting, masculine, urgent, documenting discoveries that predated even the earliest frontier settlements. The new entries were signed Jedediah Caldwell, 1798, Titan's grandfather, the legendary trapper who had vanished into the mountains 50 years before Titan's birth, leaving behind only stories and an unexplained inheritance that had funded Titan's own start in the wilderness trade. Found the cave at last. The first entry read, "The Shoshone were right about this place. It holds power older than their oldest stories. Power that calls to those who carry certain blood. The cave knows the Caldwell name. It has been waiting for us." Subsequent entries revealed a truth that reached back generations. The cave on Devil's Peak had drawn Caldwell men for over a century, each generation discovering their connection to something that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life and death. Jedediah had spent his final years documenting the cave's properties, mapping its passages, and preparing for descendants who would inevitably follow the same calling. "The mountain chooses its guardians," Jedediah had written. "Generation after generation, when the time is right, it calls us home. We are meant to understand what others cannot, that love transcends death, that some bonds cannot be broken by mere mortality, that there are places in this world where the impossible becomes possible." Titan found sketches that mapped not just the cave's physical layout, but its spiritual geography as well. Jedediah had identified chambers where the boundary between worlds grew thin, documented the times of year when supernatural activity peaked, and recorded the rituals that could facilitate communication between the living and the departed. But the most shocking discovery came in Jedediah's final entry, dated just months before his disappearance. "The iron key has been forged. When my time comes to join those who wait in the deeper chambers, I will leave it where the next guardian can find it." The key opens the heart chamber, where the mountain keeps its greatest treasure, the power to release those who are ready to cross over, and the power to join them when a guardian's work is done. Titan's hands trembled as he realized what this meant. His grandfather hadn't simply vanished into the wilderness, he had become part of the mountain's mystery, joining whatever spiritual community existed in its deepest chambers. The inheritance that had funded Titan's good trapping career hadn't come from successful business ventures, but from a family legacy that stretched back through generations of men who had served as bridges between the living and the dead. Martha appeared beside him as he processed these revelations, her expression carrying both sadness and hope. "Now you understand why we couldn't leave. We were waiting not just for you to forgive yourself, but for you to accept your heritage. You are the guardian of this place, Titan. You always have been." "What does that mean?" "It means you have the power to free us, to perform the ritual that will allow us to find peace. But it also means you have a choice to make about your own future." Before Titan could ask for clarification, Sarah's excited voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave system. "Papa, I found it! I found Grandfather's secret!" Following her voice led them through passages Titan hadn't explored, deeper into the mountain than he'd ever ventured. The tunnels grew narrower, the air thinner, until they emerged into a chamber that took his breath away. The space stretched beyond the reach of his lantern light, its walls covered in phosphorescent minerals that created a natural illumination like captured starlight. At the chamber's center lay the skeletal remains of a man, positioned as if he had simply lain down to rest and never awakened. The bones were surrounded by carefully arranged objects, trapping tools, personal effects, and journals that documented a lifetime spent in the wilderness. A leather cord around the skeleton's neck held an iron key that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Sarah stood beside the remains with the fearless curiosity that had always defined her. "Grandfather Jedemiah has been waiting too, Papa. He says the family can't be complete until all the guardians are together." Titan approached the skeleton with reverent caution, noting how the bones showed no signs of violence or distress. Jedemiah Caldwell had died peacefully in this sacred chamber, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the comfort of spiritual communion with those who had gone before. The key felt warm in Titan's hands as he lifted it from the skeleton's neck. The moment his fingers closed around the iron, the chamber filled with presence, not just Martha and Sarah, but dozens of figures stretching back through generations. Caldwell men and their families, all connected by the mountain's calling, all part of a spiritual lineage that had guarded this sacred place for over a century. "We are the keepers," a voice spoke, not Jedemiah exactly, but something that contained his essence along with others. "We maintain the boundary between worlds, help the lost find peace, and ensure that love transcends the limitations of mortal existence." Titan understood now why his family had been drawn to the cave during that fateful expedition 20 years ago. It hadn't been his idea for a family adventure. It had been the mountain calling them home, summoning the next guardian and his loved ones to take their place in an ancient cycle of service and sacrifice. "The choice is yours," Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "You can use the key to free us, to send us into the light where we can find eternal peace. But doing so means accepting your role as guardian, which means staying here to help others who come seeking what we have found. Or," Titan asked, though he already knew the answer, "or you can choose to join us now, to cross over together and leave this place unguarded until the mountain calls another to take your place." Sarah moved to his side, her small hand slipping into his with the trust that had always existed between them. "Either way, Papa, we'll be together. That's all we ever wanted." Titan looked around the chamber at the evidence of his family's legacy, generations of Caldwells who had chosen service over personal desires, who had accepted the burden of being bridges between worlds. The key in his hand held the power to complete their story, but the ending remained his choice. The weight of decision settled over him like winter snow, quiet and cold, and absolutely final. Whatever choice he made would echo through generations yet to come, determining not just his family's fate, but the future of everyone who would seek answers in the mountain's sacred chambers. In the phosphorescent light of the heart chamber, surrounded by the spiritual presence of his ancestors and the patient love of his wife and daughter, Titan Caldwell prepared to make the most important decision of his life or his death. The journey back to Cedar Ridge felt like traveling between different worlds. Titan carried the iron key in his pocket alongside the wooden horse and his daughter's dress, three impossible objects that served as proof of everything he'd discovered in the mountain's depths. The town looked smaller somehow, its collection of wooden buildings and rutted streets diminished by comparison to the vast spiritual landscape he'd encountered in the cave. Ezra waited in his cluttered cabin with the patience of someone who understood that certain revelations required their own timing. He looked up from his books as Titan entered, noting immediately the change in the trapper's demeanor, the weight of new knowledge, the burden of choices that would affect more than one man's fate. "You found the truth," Ezra observed, setting aside a volume that detailed indigenous spiritual practices. Titan placed the iron key on Ezra's table, watching the elderly historian's eyes widen with recognition. "My grandfather's key opened something called the heart chamber. Jedemiah's legacy." Ezra handled the key with reverent care, noting the symbols etched into its surface. "I've been researching your family's connection to Devil's Peak for 30 years, ever since I first heard stories about the Guardian bloodline. How much did you learn?" Over the next hour, Titan shared everything: the suppressed memories of his family's real death, the journal entries documenting their existence in the cave, the revelation about generations of Caldwell guardians who had served as bridges between the living and the dead. Ezra listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as pieces of a lifelong puzzle finally fell into place. "The mountain chooses its guardians carefully," Ezra said when Titan finished. "The Shoshone have stories about men who disappear into Devil's Peak and become something more than human, something less than divine. Protectors who help lost souls find peace, who maintain the balance between worlds." What exactly does the ritual involve? Ezra moved to a particular bookshelf, retrieving materials he'd clearly prepared for this moment. The ceremony itself is simple in concept, but demanding in execution. It requires entering the heart chamber at precisely the right time, when the spiritual energy peaks and the boundary between worlds grows thinnest. He spread ancient diagrams across his table, showing the arrangement of elements needed for the ritual. Native herbs to purify the space, river stones arranged in sacred patterns, personal objects that anchor the spirits to this realm, and most importantly, the willingness to make sacrifice either of personal desires for reunion or of mortal existence itself. When is the right time? Tomorrow night. The winter solstice approaches, when darkness holds dominion and the veil between worlds reaches its thinnest point. If you're going to free your family, it must happen then. Titan spent the remainder of the day gathering the materials Ezra specified. Each item carried symbolic weight that connected to indigenous traditions predating any European settlement. Sage bundles for purification, river stones worn smooth by centuries of flowing water, crystals that could focus spiritual energy, and herbs that would help facilitate communication between realms. The townspeople watched his preparations with the intuitive understanding that frontier communities developed about important events. Word spread quietly that Titan Caldwell was planning something significant on Devil's Peak, something that would either bring him peace or claim him entirely. No one asked direct questions, but several offered assistance. Henrik provided the finest rope in his store. The blacksmith sharpened Titan's tools to razor perfection, and the town's women prepared food that would sustain a man through whatever trials awaited. As evening approached, Titan found himself standing at the cemetery, where two wooden crosses marked the supposed graves of his wife and daughter. The deception felt heavy now that he knew the truth, but he understood why his traumatized mind had needed the fiction. The fever story had allowed him to grieve without drowning in guilt, to function despite loss, to survive long enough to discover his true purpose. "Forgive me," he whispered to the empty graves. "Forgive me for forgetting the truth, for leaving you to wait so long, for not understanding what I was meant to do." The wind through the pine trees carried what might have been voices, what could have been forgiveness, what felt like blessing for the difficult choice that lay ahead. That evening, Ezra joined him for what might be their final conversation. The elderly historian had become more than a source of information. He represented the human connection that Titan would sacrifice if he chose to join his family in whatever realm awaited beyond the heart chamber. "Are you certain about this path?" Ezra asked, pouring coffee that steamed in the cabin's warm air. "I've spent 20 years running from responsibility I didn't know I carried. My family has been trapped in that mountain because I couldn't face the truth about their deaths, couldn't accept my role as guardian, couldn't choose between duty and desire. And now?" Titan touched the key in his pocket, feeling its warmth pulse against his palm. "Now I understand that some choices aren't really choices at all. They're recognitions of what we were always meant to do." Ezra nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent decades studying the intersection of love, loss, and spiritual obligation. If you choose the Guardian's path, if you free your family and remain to serve others, you won't be entirely alone. The mountain has ways of providing companionship for those who dedicate themselves to its service. "What do you mean?" "Other spirits seek the peace you could offer, Lost souls who've been waiting for someone with the power to help them cross over. Families separated by death who need assistance finding each other. The work of a guardian is never solitary, even if it is eternal. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, each man contemplating choices that would echo through generations. Titan thought about the life he'd built around solitude and grief, the careful routines that had kept him functional but never truly alive. Against that, he weighed the possibility of reunion with his family, the chance to heal wounds that had festered for 20 years. But underneath both alternatives lay a deeper truth, his connection to something larger than personal happiness or individual loss. The Caldwell bloodline carried responsibility for maintaining a sacred space where love could transcend death, where the impossible became possible for those who needed it most. "There's something else you should know," Ezra said as the evening wound toward its conclusion. "If you choose to free your family and accept the guardian's role, it doesn't mean you'll never see them again. The boundary between realms grows thin in the heart chamber. Guardians report regular communion with those they've helped cross over. Communion, but not reunion. A different kind of relationship, less physical, more spiritual. The love remains, but it takes new forms appropriate to your respective states of existence." As midnight approached, Titan made his final preparations. He wrote letters to be delivered if he didn't return messages of gratitude to the townspeople who had shown him kindness, instructions for the disposition of his few possessions, and requests that his story be remembered accurately rather than romanticized. The climb to Devil's Peak felt different this time, weighted with purpose rather than driven by desperation. Each step carried him closer to resolution, to the moment when 20 years of grief and guilt would finally find their proper conclusion. The mountain seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it too understood that the time for waiting was nearly over. At the cave entrance, Titan paused to look back at the valley below. Cedar Ridge lay wrapped in darkness, its few scattered lights representing the ordinary human world he might be leaving forever. The sight filled him with both sadness and gratitude, sadness for the connections he would sacrifice, gratitude for the community that had sustained him through his darkest years. Inside the cave, Martha and Sarah waited with the patient love that had defined their vigil. But now, their presence carried urgency as well as affection. The time for decision had arrived, and whatever choice Titan made would determine not just their fate, but the future of everyone who would seek answers in the mountain's sacred chambers. The iron key felt heavier as he descended toward the heart chamber, weighted with the power to unlock doors between worlds and the responsibility to choose wisely which threshold to cross. The heart chamber thrummed with energy as Titan entered, the phosphorescent walls pulsing in rhythm with something that felt like the mountain's own heartbeat. Martha and Sarah stood beside Jedemiah's remains, their forms more solid than he'd ever seen them, as if the chamber's power strengthened their connection to the physical world. "It's time, Papa," Sarah said, her voice carrying both excitement and solemnity. "Grandfather says the door between worlds is opening." Titan arranged the ritual materials according to Ezra's instructions, creating sacred patterns that had been used by indigenous peoples for countless generations. The sage bundles filled the chamber with purifying smoke when lit, while the river stones formed geometric shapes that seemed to channel the cave's spiritual energy into focused streams. At the pattern center, he placed Sarah's wooden doll, the original toy from her grave, retrieved during his preparation for this moment. The simple carved figure would serve as an anchor point for the ceremony, a physical representation of the love that had bound his family together across the boundary of death. "The key opens more than doors," Martha explained as he worked. "It opens possibilities. You can use it to free us, to send us into the light where we can find eternal peace. Or you can use it to join us in the Guardian's realm, where we would serve together until the mountain calls another to take our place. What would you choose?" Martha's smile carried infinite understanding. "We would choose whatever brings you peace, my love. Our happiness doesn't depend on your decision, it depends on your healing. We've waited 20 years for you to forgive yourself. That's all we ever wanted." Sarah moved closer, her presence radiating the uncomplicated love that had always existed between them. "I miss the swing, Papa, and our games by the fireplace, and the stories you used to tell. But missing isn't the same as needing." I learned that while we waited, the ritual circle completed, Titan knelt at its center, with the iron key warming in his palm. The chamber's energy built steadily, creating pressure that he felt in his bones and behind his eyes. Reality grew thin around the edges, allowing glimpses of other realms that existed parallel to the world he'd always known. Spirits began to gather in the chamber's shadows, not just his family, but dozens of figures representing everyone who had found peace through the Guardian's service. They formed a silent congregation, witnesses to the choice that would determine whether their sanctuary continued or ended with Titan's decision. "I understand now," Titan said, his voice carrying across dimensions. "I understand why you couldn't leave, why the mountain called us here, why our family was chosen for this responsibility." The key began to glow as spiritual energy concentrated around the ritual space. Where its light touched the chamber walls, new symbols appeared, ancient markings that documented the sacred covenant between the Caldwell bloodline and the forces that governed life, death, and the spaces between them. "The choice has always been about love," Martha said, her form growing brighter as the ceremony reached its crucial moment. "Not possessive love that chains souls to earthly existence, but generous love that gives freedom even when it means separation." Titan felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, grandfather Jedemiah, and all the guardians who had come before, his own family who had waited in patient faith, and the countless souls who would seek healing in this sacred place. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. For the first time in 20 years, he knew exactly what he was meant to do. "I choose to free you," he said, raising the key toward the chamber's apex. "I choose to let you find the peace you've been seeking, even if it means I remain behind to serve others who will need what this place offers." Sarah clapped her hands with delight. "Papa, that means you really forgive yourself. That means we can finally go home to the bright place." The key's glow intensified, casting light that revealed the chamber's true nature. The walls dissolved to show vast spaces beyond, realms of existence where love transcended. Physical limitations and family bonds endured without requiring physical presence. Through those transparent boundaries, Titan glimpsed the bright place Sarah had mentioned, a realm of peace and joy, where his family could exist without the limitations that death had imposed. But as the ceremony reached its climax, the chamber began to shake. Rock dust fell from the ceiling as supernatural forces clashed with the mountain's physical structure. The ritual was destabilizing the very foundations that had supported this sacred space for generations. "Something's wrong," Martha said, her voice carrying concern for the first time since his arrival. "The energy is too strong. The mountain can't contain what we're unleashing." Titan realized the terrible truth. Freeing his family would require destroying the chamber that had served as sanctuary for countless others. The ritual's power was too great for the ancient stone formations to withstand. If he completed the ceremony, he would lose not just his family, but the sacred space that future guardians would need to help other lost souls. The choice became agonizingly clear. He could save his family and destroy their legacy, or preserve the sanctuary and accept continued separation from those he loved most. The chamber's destruction accelerated as conflicting energies tore at the ancient stone. Cracks spread across the phosphorescent walls like lightning, and the temperature fluctuated wildly between scorching heat and bone-deep cold. Titan realized he had moments to make a choice that would echo through eternity. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with the clarity that only children possessed in moments of crisis. "Papa, look! The circles are wrong!" She pointed to the stone arrangement he'd created, according to Ezra's instructions. The pattern was beautiful but incomplete, missing the crucial element that would allow the ritual to succeed without destroying its sacred space. In the growing supernatural turbulence, Titan saw what his daughter had recognized immediately. The circle of river stones needed a center point, not an object, but a person. Someone had to remain within the pattern to anchor the spiritual energy while it completed its work, channeling the forces safely through a human conduit instead of letting them tear apart the mountain itself. The Guardian's true sacrifice, Jedemiah's voice whispered through the dimensional chaos. Not separation from family, but becoming the bridge that allows others to reunite with theirs. Martha understood immediately. No, Titan, there has to be another way. We won't accept your death as the price of our freedom. But Titan was already moving toward the circle's center, the iron key burning in his hand like a star. It's not death, he said with sudden, absolute certainty. It's transformation. I'll become part of this place permanently, able to help others while staying connected to both worlds. The solution felt right in ways that transcended logic. Instead of choosing between serving others and reuniting with his family, he could do both by becoming something new, a guardian who existed in the space between realms, is able to facilitate healing for the living while maintaining communion with the departed. Are you certain? Martha asked, her love and concern warring with hope in her translucent features. I've never been more certain of anything. Titan stepped into the circle's heart, feeling the chaotic energies immediately begin to stabilize around his presence. This is what I was born for. What we were all born for. Sarah danced with excitement despite the chamber's continued trembling. Papa will be the bridge, like the rainbow bridge in the old stories, connecting earth to heaven. The key in Titan's hand began to reshape itself, transforming from simple iron into something that pulsed with organic life. Tendrils of energy extended from it into the stone circle, then upward toward the chamber's ceiling, creating a web of light that captured and redirected the ritual's power. Instead of destroying the sacred space, the ceremony began to expand it. New passages opened in the chamber walls, revealing additional rooms where future guardians could serve. The phosphorescent minerals grew brighter, creating illumination that would guide lost souls toward healing. The very air became charged with compassion, turning the entire cave system into a beacon for those who needed what only love could provide. Titan felt his physical form dissolving, but instead of fear, he experienced liberation. His consciousness expanded to encompass the entire mountain, feeling every chamber, sensing every visitor who had ever sought comfort in the sacred spaces. He became the cave's living heart, aware and caring and eternally present. Martha and Sarah began to glow with increasing brightness as the ritual freed them from their earthly tether. But instead of disappearing, they remained visible within the chamber, their forms now composed of pure light rather than ectoplasmic memory. We can still be together, Martha said with wonder. Different than before, but together. Forever and always, Sarah added, spinning in circles of pure joy. Papa's the mountain now, and we're the light that guides people home. The chamber stabilized as the transformation completed. Where Titan's physical body had stood, a pillar of warm, living stone now rose toward the ceiling. The pillar pulsed with gentle light, and within that light, his consciousness remained fully aware and accessible to anyone who needed guidance. The iron key had become part of the pillar itself, embedded at heart level, where future visitors could touch it and feel the Guardian's presence. Around the base, the river stones had fused into a perfect circle, creating a sacred space where the grieving could commune with lost loved ones under the Guardian's protection. Martha and Sarah took their places beside the pillar, their light forms serving as beacons for souls transitioning between realms. They had found their peace at last, but they had chosen to remain as guides and comforters rather than departing for distant heavens. The work continues. Titan's voice echoed through dimensions, warm and reassuring and eternally patient. Love continues, family continues. Only the form changes. The mountain settled into its new configuration, forever altered but stronger than before. Devil's Peak had become what it was always meant to be, a place where love transcended death, where families could heal across the boundaries of existence, where the impossible became possible through the power of sacrifice and service. In the heart chamber, 3 lights danced together in patterns of eternal reunion, waiting to help the next soul who would climb the mountain, seeking what seemed lost forever. Spring came early to Cedar Ridge that year, as if the mountain's transformation had influenced the very weather patterns that governed the valley. Ezra stood at the cave entrance, placing the final touches on a wooden cross he'd carved with meticulous care. The inscription read simply, "Here love conquered death, Titan Caldwell, Guardian Eternal." Word of what had happened on Devil's Peak spread slowly through the frontier communities, carried by travelers who spoke of strange lights dancing in the cave and voices that offered comfort to the grieving. The stories were always the same: lost souls finding peace, families separated by death, discovering new ways to connect, and a presence in the mountain that radiated infinite patience and understanding. Henrik had aged visibly in the months since Titan's transformation, but his eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before. "Folks come from hundreds of miles now," he told Ezra as they descended the mountain trail together. "Widows and widowers, parents who've lost children, anyone carrying grief too heavy for ordinary comfort. And they find what they're seeking? Most do, not always the reunion they expect, but healing they didn't dare hope for." Henrik paused to rest on a fallen log, gazing back toward the peak that had claimed his friend and transformed him into something beyond human understanding. Titans become something special up there, something needed. The transformation had indeed created something unprecedented in the frontier territories. The cave system had become a pilgrimage destination for those wrestling with loss, guided by stories of a guardian who understood grief because he had transcended it. Native tribes spoke of renewed spiritual energy in the mountain, while frontier families shared tales of impossible comfort found in the sacred chambers. Ezra had documented dozens of encounters over the past months. A father who had lost his son in a hunting accident found the boy's favorite fishing lure placed carefully on the heart chamber's altar, accompanied by a sense of forgiveness that lifted years of guilt. A widow discovered her husband's wedding ring, buried with him 3 years earlier, waiting for her beside the guardian's pillar, along with the understanding that love endured beyond physical separation. Each story followed similar patterns. Visitors would arrive carrying objects that connected them to deceased loved ones, hoping against hope for some sign that death wasn't the final ending. In the cave's depths, they would find evidence that love transcended mortality, not in the form of ghostly visitations, but as profound spiritual experiences that healed wounds no earthly medicine could touch. The mountain chooses who comes, Ezra had learned through careful observation. Not everyone who seeks the cave actually finds it. The path appears only for those ready to receive what Titan offers. Children seemed particularly drawn to the guardian's presence. They would enter the cave fearlessly, drawn by Sarah's light form dancing through the chambers. Parents reported their grieving children returning from the mountain with renewed joy, as if they had played with an invisible friend who reminded them that love never truly dies. Martha's presence manifested differently, offering comfort to spouses and partners who struggled with survivor's guilt. Her warm, maternal energy provided the understanding that only someone who had experienced profound love could offer. Visitors spoke of feeling embraced by invisible arms, of hearing whispered reassurances in voices that reminded them of their lost companions. But it was Titan's transformed consciousness that anchored the entire phenomenon. His awareness encompassed every chamber, every visitor, every moment of pain or healing that occurred within the mountain's embrace. He had become a living bridge between realms, facilitating connections that would otherwise remain forever severed. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge adapted to their unique status as guardians of a miracle. They provided guidance to pilgrims, offered shelter to those making the difficult journey, and maintained respectful silence about the specific details of what occurred in the cave. The mountain's power was too sacred to exploit, too precious to commercialize. Henrik established a small shrine at the base of Devil's Peak, where visitors could leave offerings and prepare themselves spiritually before ascending to the cave. The shrine's centerpiece was Titan's original wooden horse, the toy that had begun his journey toward understanding, surrounded by mementos left by grateful families who had found healing in the mountain's embrace. "He's still helping people," Henrik would tell visitors who asked about the Guardian's story. "Different than before, but stronger too. Love finds a way, especially love that's been tested by loss." Ezra continued his documentation, creating a record that would guide future generations seeking to understand the mountain's power. His journals detailed not just the supernatural phenomena, but the psychological and spiritual healing that occurred when people encountered evidence that their deepest bonds transcended physical existence. The wooden cross he'd placed at the cave entrance became a symbol recognized throughout the territory. Travelers spoke of it as a marker indicating that miracles were possible, that love could indeed conquer death when approached with proper reverence and genuine need. As summer settled over the valley, Ezra made his final visit to the heart chamber. The pillar that contained Titan's consciousness pulsed with warm light, while Martha and Sarah's forms danced nearby in patterns of eternal joy. The chamber itself had grown more beautiful over the months, its phosphorescent walls brightening in response to each healing that occurred within its embrace. "Thank you," Ezra whispered to the Guardian's presence, "for showing us that some endings are really beginnings." The response came not as words, but as feeling a profound sense of purpose fulfilled, of love that had found its truest expression through service to others. Titan had discovered what the Caldwell bloodline had always been meant for, creating spaces where the impossible became possible, where love transcended every limitation that mortality could impose. In the years that followed, Devil's Peak became known throughout the frontier as a place of healing and hope. The Guardian's legend grew with each family that found peace in the sacred chambers, each child who learned that death wasn't the end of love, each spouse who discovered that bonds forged in life could endure beyond the grave. The mountain stands eternal now, crowned by its sacred cave, where three lights dance in patterns of endless reunion. And somewhere in the heart chamber, a guardian waits with infinite patience for the next soul who needs to learn that love, once true, never truly dies. It simply finds new ways to express itself across the vast spaces between earth and heaven.